Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Lou Rubulis, Client Relations at CIM. On behalf of the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee, we thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanyen Kehaka Mohawk, a place which was long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. Most of us attending today are also on traditional unceded territory. Today's session will be the first of a series focusing on the new TSM protocols. And now, without further ado, I would like to present the moderator of this session, Miriam Clark, VP Global Strategy and Business Growth at Okane Consultants. Welcome, Miriam.
Thank you so much, Mary Lou, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So in June of 2023, the Mining Association of Canada members adopted a new Towards Sustainable Mining, Equitable, Diverse, and Inclusive Workplace Protocol. Now, fostering inclusive workplaces is critical now more than ever, with the global mining sectors feeling the effects of a labour market tightening. To quote Pierre Gratton, Canada's mining sector is facing a people crisis. We all know that we're faced with challenges like an aging workforce, decreasing enrollment in post-secondary mining programs, historically low mining unemployment rate, and continued challenges to attract and retain underrepresented groups. And these groups who have been historically underrepresented in the mining industry, groups like women, Indigenous people, racialized persons and visible minorities, people who identify as 2S LGBTQ+, newcomers or immigrants, and persons with disabilities truly present an untapped opportunity for our industry. The business case for diverse workforces is clear. A study by McKinsey & Company in 2019 highlights that companies with more than 30% female executives were more likely to outperform companies with lower percentages of gender diversity. In addition, the top quartile of companies with ethnic and cultural diversity outperform those in the bottom quartile by more than 30% in profitability. This TSM protocol is intended to support three things: a corporate strategy for equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplaces, processes to foster a workplace culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion at the mine site, and approaches to information gathering, reporting, and setting objectives on equity, diversity, and inclusion at the mine site. To provide an overview of the protocol, present an example of its implementation, and share some tools that you will be able to leverage for your organization, I'm very excited today to be joined by three inspirational panelists. Our first panelist will be Katherine Gosselin, Director of Towards Sustainable Mining, Mining Association of Canada, who will give us an overview of the new protocol. Then we'll pass things off to Debbie Foster, HR Business Partner, Everyday Respect from the Iron Ore Company of Canada, who will present a case study for the implementation of the protocol in Rio Tinto's Canadian offices. And third, we'll be joined by Leslie Woolcott, Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Mining Industry Human Resources Council, who will share some tools and resources that are available to help you implement the protocol in your workplaces. After their presentations, we'll open things up to some discussion and some Q&A. So I would encourage you to please use the chat function in Zoom to type out your questions. We'll do our best to answer all of them during the Q&A protocol, but we will collect them all and reach out to you after the fact if we don't make it to your question today. So without further ado, I'll pass things off to Katherine. Could you kick us off with an introduction and an overview of the new protocol?
Yes, great. Thanks, Miriam. And I'll just wait for my presentation to load on the screen. Okay. Thanks so much, Mary Lou. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar today. It's great to see so many people interested in learning about these new requirements for TSM. I also really appreciate the opportunity to work with CIM and the Mining Industry Human Resources Council to bring you this 5-part webinar series about the new TSM protocols. And I'm very excited to share with you our work to develop new requirements for mine sites in the areas of equity, diversity, inclusion, psychological safety, and respectful behavior. The aim of my presentation today is to set up not only today's webinar, but to some extent the 4 subsequent webinars so that you have some understanding of TSM and the content of the new protocols. So I will then be relying on my expert colleagues to share their insights and experiences so that we can, I hope, help one another to implement these new requirements effectively. Next slide, please. So we'll just spend a few slides talking about the basics. What is TSM for those who might not be familiar? TSM is a sustainability standard designed to support mining companies in managing key environmental and social risks while meeting society's needs for minerals, metals, and energy products. Established nearly 20 years ago by the Mining Association of Canada, TSM was the first responsible mining standard in the world to require site-level assessments with external verification. Through TSM, mine sites develop robust sustainability management systems and report annually on key indicators of performance in areas like climate change, Indigenous and community relationships, biodiversity conservation management, and much more. And it isn't just the industry that's setting these standards or assessing their own performance. Next slide, please. As we can see here, TSM is overseen by a national multi-interest advisory body in each implementing jurisdiction. These groups ensure that the mining industry sets ambitious and credible standards for sustainability governance sustainability performance that reflect diverse stakeholder expectations in unique national and cultural contexts. And these advisory bodies serve as an important fora for national dialogue around emerging issues for key stakeholders with an interest in improving the mining industry's sustainability performance. Next slide. And though it first began in Canada, TSM is no longer just a Canadian program. As you can see from the map on this screen, TSM is being implemented around the world. TSM is primarily adopted and implemented by national mining associations, and those associations in turn require their members to implement the program, leading to rapid and widespread uptake of TSM in each jurisdiction. And as a result of this approach, we now have over 250 mining companies implementing the program through TSM partner associations around the world, including in other major mining jurisdictions like Brazil and Australia. While TSM began as a program focused on improving mine site performance, we now see growing interest in and recognition of the value of TSM from supply chain customers as well. For example, those in the technology and automotive sectors, as well as from investors looking for reliable ESG data to inform their investment decisions. Next slide. So it's within the context of the broader TSM program that we have introduced the new requirements on equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplaces that we'll be covering over the course of this webinar series. While TSM has for a long time driven social performance in areas like Indigenous and community relationships and safety and health, we had not yet addressed what we recognize are key challenges for the industry: equity, diversity, inclusion, psychological safety, and respectful behavior. Of course, 2020 was a real inflection point for EDI with global movements around racial injustice, which then also highlighted a range of other injustices, including in the workplace. And one of the outcomes of this was that many companies were quick to adopt commitments to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So Mining Association of Canada members were very much aware of the need to respond to these calls for action. And after many months of conversation, the Mining Association of Canada issued a public statement that committed the association's members to a number of objectives. For example, they committed to strengthen equity, diversity, and inclusion in all aspects of workplace culture, policies, procedures, and practices, to seek to identify, acknowledge, and confront conscious and unconscious bias, as well as individual and systemic racism, sexism, ableism, and discrimination, to bolster efforts to increase representation of underrepresented groups in the mining industry, to provide leadership and share effective and proven tools, resources, practices, and lessons learned, and to enhance reporting on objectives, actions, and performance. And within a few months of issuing that statement, the Mining Association of Canada's membership recognized that TSM would be an appropriate mechanism to measure implementation of those commitments. TSM, of course, has a strong track record of driving industry performance on challenging sustainability issues and provides a good model for setting standards that are both rigorous and flexible to diverse contexts. And the 5-point scale on which TSM criteria are developed is also really important because it provides facilities with meaningful and nuanced steps they can take to improve performance, regardless of where on that scale they're beginning in terms of their equity, diversity, inclusion journey. So in November 2021, we struck a working group of representatives from member companies of the Mining Association of Canada, as well as representatives from the Minerals Council of Australia and some external experts to support the development of new TSM requirements covering topics related to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And after over a year of effort by the working group, including multiple engagement sessions with the multi-interest advisory panel for the TSM program that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and a public comment period in mid-2022, we published these new requirements in June 2023. And we believe these new requirements are by far the most comprehensive on this topic of any international sustainability standard for the mining sector at this time. Next slide, please. So I'll now spend some time walking through those new performance indicators. While today's session is meant to provide an overview of the new protocol, its implementation, and available resources, each of the subsequent webinars will dive into these topics in greater detail. If you've seen the schedule for these webinars, we're going to be focusing on each of these 4 indicators you see on the screen in a separate webinar, so you will have a lot of time to explore those further and to learn from experts about approaches to implementation. These new requirements, just to clarify, appear in 2 separate documents: a brand new TSM Equitable, Diverse and Inclusive Workplaces Protocol, and revisions to the existing TSM Safety and Health Protocol, which is now called the TSM Safe, Healthy and Respectful Workplaces Protocol. So we will be looking at each of those indicators in the subsequent slides. Next slide, please. So first, to accompany the TSM Equitable, Diverse and Inclusive Workplaces Protocol, we repurposed the public statement that I mentioned a couple of slides ago from November 2020 and transformed it into a TSM framework, which is essentially a set of commitments that is then operationalized through the requirements in the protocol. So this should look quite familiar to the image that I shared a couple of slides ago. Next slide, please. And the TSM Equitable, Diverse and Inclusive Workplaces Protocol itself includes 3 performance indicators. As in other TSM protocols, each of the indicators is made up of detailed criteria at 5 levels of performance, from level C to level AAA. While TSM is traditionally focused on mine site performance, there are a few subject matter areas in which we also include corporate level requirements, and we have opted to do so in this new protocol. So the first performance indicator is to be applied at the corporate level and is meant to confirm that the corporate office engages broadly to develop a corporate strategy for equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplaces. This slide provides just a sample of some of the criteria in this indicator, as the protocol itself is quite detailed. I encourage you to review the full document, which does include more and more detailed criteria as well as guidance to support implementation. So in indicator 1, we can see, for example, requirements at level A to have a corporate commitment that's aligned with that TSM framework on equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplaces, and a corporate strategy that's developed through engagement with a cross-section of people who bring diverse perspectives and experiences. At level AA, that corporate strategy is implemented with a process for ongoing engagement and review, and objectives are set for corporate leadership, recruitment, retention, and representation. And finally, some examples of criteria at level AAA, an independent review of workplace culture with results informing further engagement, and board and management structures, accountabilities, responsibilities, and reporting processes related to the governance of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide. We then have two performance indicators at the facility or mine site level. The first one, indicator 2, is focused on the processes required to foster a workplace culture of equity, diversity, and inclusion. At level A, this includes the development of procedures and processes of all sorts, for example, through a review of existing human resources, processes, and policies, an analysis of compensation inequity, and much more that you'll see detailed in the protocol. As an indicator 1, the development of these procedures and processes is to be done through engagement with a cross-section of people who bring diverse perspectives and experiences. At level AA, those and other processes are then implemented with multiple aims, including to mitigate potential for bias in recruitment, performance management, skills development, and other human resources processes, and to address patterns of inequities in worker compensation and benefits that were identified at level A. At level AAA, for example, we have a requirement for an evaluation of effectiveness of all of those processes that appear at the previous levels of performance. Next slide, please. And finally, indicator 3 focuses on how sites can monitor and report on their performance and set relevant performance objectives. At level A, this means developing a scope and methods for data collection and reporting that's informed through engagement with a cross-section of people who bring diverse perspectives and experiences. You'll see that repeated in each of the 3 indicators. There's a public reporting of demographic diversity data with ongoing monitoring and analysis, and clear communication to workers regarding the use and management of personal data. At level AA, for example, we require public reporting of information on EDI with ongoing monitoring and analysis, and performance objectives on EDI that are accompanied by action plans and demonstrated progress. And then finally, at level AAA, public reporting on progress towards those same performance objectives that were set at level AA. Next slide. I also want to spend a moment summarizing the complementary requirements, the updates we've made to the TSM safety and health protocol. These requirements appear in a new indicator on psychological safety and respectful behavior, as well as some targeted revisions to existing performance indicators. So the new indicator includes, for example, at level A, a review of policies and processes to integrate psychological safety and respectful behavior, programs to encourage health and wellness, including mental health, and trauma-informed processes to report and respond to incidents of psychologically unsafe, harmful, or disrespectful behavior. At level AA, collaboration with communities of interest to review reporting and response processes, communication with the broader supply chain regarding policies and processes, and performance objectives are set with action plans and demonstrated progress, just like we saw in that final indicator of the Equitable, Diverse, and Inclusive Workplaces protocol. And then finally, at level AAA, there are requirements for an internal audit with results communicated to workers and the integration of psychological safety and respectful behavior in procurement practices. Next slide. So I hope that provides some helpful context for today's discussion and for other future sessions of this webinar series. Of course, I'll be happy to answer any questions about the new TSM requirements during the Q&A period, but I think we'll now pass it over to Debbie Foster from IOC to hear about their early experiences implementing these new requirements. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Katherine. And I think you set the tone very well in terms of my observations now based on the assessments that you just went through. We'll just wait for the slides to get larger. In the interim, I can introduce myself. So I'm Debbie Foster, based in Montreal. I'm HR business partner for Iron Ore Company of Canada, whose focus is primarily on EDI projects at this time. And what I'll be sharing with you today is, as she mentioned, my observations on our experience completing this assessment. So next slide, please. And a little bit perhaps for, oh, I'll just wait. If we could go on to, yeah, no problem.
Is this the first, this is the cover?
If we could go to the next slide, yeah. It's not moving.
I have to change screens. One moment, please.
And perhaps in the interim, I'll just share a little bit for those of you who aren't aware. So Iron Ore Company of Canada is a MAC member, and it's also part of the Rio Tinto group. So we extract iron ore and process them into pellets from our mine up in Labrador City in northeastern Canada, and then ship them via our train line down through to our port operations in Sept-Îles, Quebec. And we also have corporate offices in Montreal and St. John's, Newfoundland. When we were asked to complete this self-assessment in advance of the launch, we thought it was a great opportunity for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's a chance for us to take stock of our practices and look at them from a variety of different angles. It's also a great opportunity to understand if we have any gaps in our current practices and if there's anything we need to address. As MAC members, completing the assessment as well helps us understand what to expect, and also we can share feedback with people such as yourselves and also with our fellow Rio Tinto MAC members such as DIAC Diamond Mines and Rio Tinto Iron and Titanium here in Canada. And it better prepares us for future assessments. I'm just checking if the slides will be coming up. Oh, I think they're popping up. Great. So to slide two, please. So when we first completed this assessment, so I led this work, but I worked with multiple stakeholders within our organization, both within IOC and Rio Tinto globally. We shared our feedback at the advisory panel discussions last fall as well, the panel that Katherine was talking about earlier. If we go on to the next slide. And I think one thing that's important when sharing these experiences is you learn something every time when exchanging with other people who are placing importance on EDI practices in different organizations. So even when you think you've thought of every angle, this is always a good opportunity to learn from each other as well. In terms of the observations after completing the EDI assessment, I would say first and foremost, it's a great pulse check. The assessment is extremely comprehensive, and I really appreciated how it was broken down, as Katherine mentioned, into 3 key areas of leadership and strategy, practices and processes, and monitoring and reporting. This panel is timely, as I was just speaking of my experience to a colleague who will be completing it at one of our other organizations. And similar to Katherine's feedback, I echo the recommendation to look through all of the details of the assessment in advance for any of you who are preparing to complete it yourselves. It is a thorough document, it's a long document, but I do find if you read it a few times, it helps you understand the flow and the pattern of what is being asked, which helped me greatly in terms of gathering the information I needed to complete the assessment. Because I find with each indicator that was referenced, that's looked at, there's common themes. So firstly, you know, they're asking you, do you have the right structures in place? Do you have a strategy? Do you have a clear objective? Do you have an action plan? And then they go on to ask the key questions of, you know, how were these formed? Who are you connecting with to make sure that the decisions being made are thoughtful and inclusive? Are you connecting with underrepresented groups? Are you connecting with and consulting your employees, your communities? And so there's definitely a theme throughout the assessment. I think also equally important that was asked is, how are you sharing? What are you communicating? How transparent are you internally and externally? And also, you know, it's important to understand perhaps the decisions being made at the higher levels, then the support of our leaders is one thing. Do our employees understand that? Are they aware of that? How do we share our findings? How do we share our data, both internally to our people and publicly as well? So I did appreciate those type of questions that were asked to ensure that we have the right rigor in place when looking at building these programs. And I think it's also important to mention that, you know, the assessment really, I found, made sure that we're considering everything to have the strong foundation needed to have a valuable EDI practice in place. But it won't tell you at the end if your, you know, if your practices are the same as best practice. You know, the rigor, if you achieve all of the requirements, will tell you that through the work, but the assessment itself is not going to tell you that you're you know, ambitious from an EDI lens. But the fact that if you do meet that objective of having that regular independent validation of your practices, you'll find out through that rigor. So I think that's one thing that's important to highlight. It's making sure you have the foundation in place to understand what you're doing and to make sure it's well thoughtful. And from that work, you'll understand where you sit within your industry as well. So there were definitely some questions in place that I'm keen to get the answers to. For example, we're doing a new review, an independent review here at Rio Tinto this year. So some of those questions I couldn't check off yes right now, but I'm keen to see how that works and how we'll shift and adjust once we get those findings. That's something that I wanted to keep in mind and to flag to you. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of our findings, I won't go through all the details because Katherine's already gone through the different indicators, but generally we scored well. And I think that is because we do benefit from the fact that we're part of a huge global organization which you know has the capacity for a lot of rigor as well. So in terms of that space, that said, we haven't met all of the objectives and there's still work to be done. We didn't achieve our gender targets this year, which is something that's important. And we're looking at now why and what we're going to do about it. Also, you know, we have all of our leaders take EDI training, but we're not then testing their capabilities in this space. So that's something to think about. I think, you know, this assessment is great in terms of asking you questions, especially when you don't meet the objectives, to have that discussion of, you know, are we comfortable with the decision as to why we didn't make that meet that assessment objective, or do we need to adjust? So it did pose some interesting questions as well throughout this process. Also, in terms of Indigenous employment here at IOC, we're working very hard in this space. We have a dedicated Indigenous talent advisor, but we don't yet have employment targets. And we're currently exploring if that's the right thing to do right now, for example. Another point that we were looking at in terms of where we could improve from the talent lens, we do have a lot of guidelines and we have a lot of good practice within our organization. Yet sometimes we still struggle with being dependent on strong team members within the talent team that are influential to make sure that we mitigate bias, which can make us vulnerable versus the rigor of good a tightened process versus dependent on our strong talent team members' influence. So those were a few things that we noticed throughout this assessment as well in terms of considerations as we're looking to improve. And if we go on to the last slide, I think generally after completing this assessment, I was proud of where IOC is on our journey from an EDI lens. I think we do have a lot of good, we have a solid foundation in place. That being said, we're not yet near where we want to be. And this is clearly a long journey. And it's a relatively new journey, I think, for all of us, as to Katherine's point, in terms of 2020 kind of triggering a lot of reflection and action within organizations globally. Some of the things that we are on the right track on are work in the Indigenous space, which was assessed in this, even though I know they have a separate assessment, it was also touched upon in this assessment. So, IOC does have impact benefit agreements with all of the communities with land claims in our regions. And also we do have a dedicated team for Indigenous relations whose mandate is the implementation of these IBAs. Also, we have a collaborative approach with our partners and stakeholders from an environmental lens. We're looking to increase total spend with our Indigenous suppliers as well, and also to increase the number of employees and ensure that it's a welcoming place for our Indigenous talent. I think another reason why we were quite strong from a foundational lens in the EDI space is the work we've done at the IOC level and also at the Rio Tinto group-wide level in relation to everyday respect task force initiatives. So for those of you who may not be aware, in February 2022, Rio Tinto published a report that was from an independent external review of our workplace experiences of our people globally. And the findings were extremely disappointing, to say the least. So there were incidents of bullying, sexual harassment, and racism across our organization globally, with certain areas where it was particularly worse than other areas. That being said, it was clear work needed to be done everywhere across our organization. I think Rio Tinto is a microcosm of society and a microcosm of our industry. And there was a lot that we needed to do. And at the board level, there was a commitment to address all of the recommendations in that report of how to go about addressing these findings. And with that really started a huge amount of work at the global level. And then also at the regional level in roles such as myself of how to implement all of these recommendations so that they're impactful for our people. And so it's set about a large amount of work and it's setting about a foundation so that we can hopefully shift the dial in terms of the workplace experience for our people, and that people understand that respect is important and that we do not tolerate disrespectful behavior. So there's been a lot of work in that space and a variety of work, be it from supporting people at early stages in their career to supporting our contractors to ensuring we have rigor in terms of inclusive facilities and so on. So I think that really set us up in terms of being strong in the assessment. But again, as I mentioned, we're definitely, I think, at the beginning of our journey in this space. Other areas that we benefit from, we definitely have supportive leadership at the IOC level and at the global level. And also, I think one of the reasons why we'll continue to improve in this space is that there's a lot of hard and good practice in our communities that we're trying to elevate so people can take inspiration from each other. I'm not sure if you guys are similar, but I do find in these remote mining communities, people are so proud of their communities, and there's a lot of heart in that community, in these communities. And I think if we showcase that more, it inspires everyone to be our best, and that includes in terms of respect and inclusion. And that's one of the things I think that we're strong at within our organization, and that helps us in this space. So I think from that end, that's all I had for now, unless anyone had questions. Otherwise, I'll pass it on to Leslie.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a really helpful presentation. I really appreciate that. While I'm waiting for Mary Lou to load my slides, I'll just mention for myself that I'm joining from the traditional Mississauga-Anishinaabe territory, the land associated with the Williams Treaty of 1923 and Rice Lake Treaty number 20 of 1818. My presence here in Nogo-Jiwinang or Peterborough connects me to Curve Lake First Nation, Alderville First Nation, Hiawatha First Nation, and the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. I'll share just a little bit in terms of myself. I'm really very happy to be supporting and working with the mining industry, or the Mining Association of Canada, through the Mining Industry Human Resources Council, to support implementation of the TSM protocols that Katherine provided a helpful overview on today. With some, goodness gracious, almost 33 years in the equity, diversity, and inclusion space, it's really very exciting to work at a sector level, thinking about how different organizations come together, stakeholders come together to really advance change. Thank you, Mary Lou. That's excellent. Just before moving to that initial slide, I will just share that the Mining Industry Human Resources Council, for folks who may not be aware, we are an independent nonprofit organization that leads collaboration among mining and exploration stakeholders to understand labor market trends, identify opportunities, and develop solutions. So we've been working, on to the next slide. We've been working since about November 2022, so about a 17-month project in all, to advance a number of different EDI-related program supports. This is part of a larger mining sector skills solution project that we have, and I've just put a link to a PDF that we have that will give you a full overview of that full project. It's a multi-million-dollar project. All of the deliverables will be done by the end of March 2024. So through this slide, I'm just going to run you through some things that we have been focusing on these last number of months, particularly with regard to EDI, and particularly, as you'll see as we progress, in terms of supporting implementation of the new protocols under TSM. So we've conducted some labor market analysis and related research with regard to equity, diversity, and inclusion related barriers, effective practices, and indicators. The barriers report is up on our website, and the labor market analysis is in its final stages and should be up shortly. We have engaged, we did have a workshop this fall to help sector stakeholders understand how to use labor market analysis to set effective EDI targets. We are working through an EDI toolkit, which I will provide more elaboration on through the following slides. And we have, we're in the process of upgrading our ensemble online networking space so that we can help advance the dialogue around implementation and use of these tools. We have offered workplace disability management reviews through the National Institute for Disability Management and Research in BC. We're working on a brief regarding innovation and accommodating persons with disabilities in the sector. And we have an upcoming webinar on that with CIM on February 22nd. We're doing some work around equity deserving groups and careers in due regard to the labor force challenges that the sector is facing. And we just last week had a webinar focused sharing the information coming out of our work on integrating newcomers into the sector and looking at government programs and opportunities available there. So CIM kindly collaborated with us on a session around that just last week. I think significantly that all of these materials that I'll be talking about today and all of these items and programs that are identified on this slide have been developed through engagement with subject matter experts and through the development and through feedback from MiHR's Inclusion and Diversity Standing Committee, which involves a number of company representatives and sector stakeholders. So we're getting strong EDI related feedback and subject matter expertise from a number of groups that represent Indigenous communities, for example, gender-based and 2S LGBTQIA communities, female or women-based organizations, organizations supporting persons with disabilities, folks with strong anti-racist education subject matter expertise and experience. So we're really very happy with the robust nature of these materials. Next slide. The next slide is going to give you a little bit of an overview of our approach to some of these, to the process, to how we implemented and created the full toolkit and learning materials. So MiHR had an Indigenous awareness training. This graphic represents the online learning programs that MiHR has. All of the pieces we're talking about today are geared towards being aligned with and supporting sector stakeholders to implement the Towards Sustainable Mining protocols that Katherine indicated today, and also complement work on the Indigenous and Community Relations Protocol. So just to give a bit of a focus to the thinking, MiHR has an existing program on Indigenous awareness that was launched maybe 18 months ago. And I think that's an excellent program, if I do say so myself, that's focused on Indigenous awareness and the mining sector. We have brushed off our gender equity in mining online program. I'll speak a little bit more to that. MiHR has an existing intercultural awareness online training program that is a nice gateway to all of these topics. And then we're due to be launching shortly in February new training that looks at bias and systemic racism, and I'll speak a little bit more to that. But importantly, we wanted to we've created this focus so that folks could approach their change management, as is indicated in TSM, by focusing on any one or more equity-seeking groups and equity-deserving groups that one might like, that an organization so chooses and deems appropriate to their context, and then can focus some of their work through a focused change management or an integrated change management program that focuses on a couple of different groups, one or more groups. Next slide. So the toolkit then will involve a number of materials, and they help to fill in that central space around change management. So we speak to a case for EDI mining. There are guides to correspond with each of the indicators in the EDI protocol. There are accompanying infographics, tip sheets, postcards, there are templates, and then there's a matrix or key so folks can see how the different materials will help companies and organizations meet the different criteria. Our training programs that I've spoken to will all be in that neighborhood of an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. We've tried to make them as interactive as possible. And I'll just go to the next slide, please, Mary Lou, and I'll speak a little bit to our approach to the Gender Equity in Mining online program. So this program, MiHR, has had a Gender Equity in Mining online program for a number of years. Its approach was fairly binary in process, in context, really talking. So what we wanted to do was broaden that out to explore issues around gender identity and expression. There's a next module that gets to sexual orientation and attraction. There's an overview around intersectionality. Then to complement some of our work that we've been doing around safe workplaces for all, the last module focuses in on sexual harassment. And again, the toolkit materials then can be applied alongside that training program. Then on to the next slide. The next program that we're going to be launching, I think just to mention, I just this morning reviewed the final version of that Gender Equity in Mining training program. So its launch is imminent, and the anti-racism training, which is focused on bias, systemic discrimination, and anti-racism, its launch is slated for February. That includes the following sections: one focused on an introduction to racism and its impact in mining. Another speaks to bias, stereotypes, and prejudice, helping people to understand these key concepts, linking this all to systemic discrimination, and then helping people to move actively into the anti-racism and anti-racism approaches. So I think what I'll do is move to the next slide, which will enable folks maybe to see a little bit more about how the toolkit then will play out. So this gives you a little bit more context around the toolkit, and I think with each of the additional sessions in the webinar series, we'll delve a little bit more deeply into each of these tools as they're appropriate to the particular session. But we've created these guides and infographics that pair with each of the indicators in the EDI protocol, as well as focused one guide on community identity and collaboration as a key element within the EDI protocol. And that one gets to some of the nitty-gritty around identity validation with local communities and local rights holders. And so we're excited to have Indigenous perspective coming forward and expertise coming forward in a subsequent session to help us walk through that community identity and collaboration guide. And then we've got a number of keys that will help with preparing for each of the criteria. And you can see the focus area for each of those tip sheets. We did prepare one that will focus in on the psychological safety under the revised protocol that Katherine mentioned. And then on to the next slide. We've got some postcards that complement those tip sheets, and they're really intended as pieces that people can take away on their own, that they can be made available in the workplace, and people can think about, and learn a little bit more just in little snippets for moving understanding and awareness forward. I mentioned the case for advancing equity, valuing diversity, practice, and inclusion, and the matrix that will also be made available. I'm going to turn to the next slide and just highlight some of the complementary work that we've been doing around safe workplaces for all, because it complements some of the work around gender equity in mining and some of the pieces around psychological safety as well in the workplace. So these materials are, I think with the exception of one item, these materials are all on our website at this time. So through this 3-year project, MiHR created a report and materials to help with addressing sexual harassment and gender-based violence in the sector. We created a comprehensive research report that looks at what's going on in the sector and speaks to legislative compliance and runs through the various factors for organizations to consider and take stock of in terms of obligations, risks, and opportunities. There's a really great infographic that I think will provides companies excuse me, with a helpful overview of the legislative requirements embedded in health and safety legislation across different provincial and territorial jurisdictions to understand the requirements with regard to harassment and violence in the workplace. We created a number of posters, which you can see depicted in some way on this slide, postcards and stickers to help advance that conversation around sexual harassment and workplace violence. Significantly, the posters, postcards, and stickers have been translated as a pilot into Inuktitut, and they're available now on our website. And just on to the next slide. We also have just recently finalized a selection of tip sheets that will help people in the workplace with trauma-informed approaches, with reporting, with managing incident-related information and maintaining confidentiality, and with processes around documentation. We also have created a sample sexual harassment policy and procedure, and there's an infographic, kind of a process map that we're just putting the finishing touches on. And significantly, we've created a guide and risk assessment tool focused on supporting organizations to address domestic violence as it presents in the workplace and poses safety-related risk in the workplace. And there's an infographic related to that. And I'll say with regard to these materials in particular, we've had legal expertise commenting and helping to guide this work, and we're grateful to Bennett Jones for their help and support with that. I will say that our reviewer at Bennett Jones did share with us that she thought that the piece on domestic violence was amongst the best she had seen, so we're quite proud of that. And I think with that, I'll leave that, knowing I'll leave folks for questions and turn it back to Miriam, knowing that we will provide more in-depth information and run through more specifically some of these tools in the future or subsequent sessions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to reiterate to everybody who's joining us today, we are taking questions in the chat. So I would very much encourage you, any questions that you have regarding any of the materials that our panelists have presented here today, please put your questions in the chat and I will make sure that we get them asked. But maybe to kick us off, Debbie, one of the things I liked that you spoke about was how when you were doing your self-assessment, it allowed you to pose some interesting questions to yourselves and to your leadership team. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, as a leader in the industry, like how do you highlight the value that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs can create for your company or the industry?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a good question. I think the tie with psychological safety, and I feel as if EDI is becoming more and more connected with safety than before because of the emphasis and importance on mental health and psychological safety. And I think they're interconnected, that I don't think it's that challenging to try to convince leaders that it's important that people feel respected and safe at work. I think there has been a shift in that is the intent. Most people want that felt experience for their people. I think the challenge is more understanding what to do about it and how to shift the dial. But I don't think getting people on board with making people feel safe is hard, or I haven't seen that in my experience with an IOC or Rio Tinto. And when the findings came out of all of the challenges we did face, there was a unanimous response that we need to do something about it and take it seriously. So I don't see much struggle in that space. It's the how, and how to make it impactful and sustainable is the biggest challenge.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, you talked about the Rio February 2022 report, and I think it was very brave, I'm going to say, of Rio to choose to share that report. I don't think Rio is unique in the findings of that report. I think that some of the findings are prevalent throughout the mining industry, and I thought it was really, really brave that that Rio shared that. Is there any plans to update that?
There are. So I believe they're planning a review this year. So 3 years later, given the original work was done in 2021, published 2022. So yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of psychological safety and sort of key trends in this theme of diversity, inclusion, and equity, I keep hearing this term belonging, and how that's sort of becoming a new term in the industry. Leslie, maybe I could pass it off to you. Is that something that you've been hearing about, something you could share some insights into?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been hearing that. I've been hearing that both from folks in the sector and people who work more broadly in the EDI space in other areas. I think that's happening because it's an element of inclusion, or it's a bit, some think of it as an outcome of inclusion or a measure or indicator of inclusion. I think the other piece on that is that we see that we can make, it's a bit of an employer or organization can make a strong effort to be inclusive, but it's not until we see how that's received as a feeling of belonging that we know about the kind of effectiveness of our efforts.
Yeah, sort of efforts versus outcomes, maybe. Yeah. Well, speaking of sort of efforts, Katherine, we've had a question, I think, for you that comes through the chat, which is about when TSM was developing the protocol, was there any, or did you come across of any research, whether from mining or other industries, on the appropriate ratio of equity, diversity, and inclusion practitioners in a given company relative to its employee size or footprint?
I guess I would say no, I don't recall coming across any research to that effect. I don't know, Leslie, if in your team's research you've come across anything speaking about an ideal ratio of practitioners to employees.
No, I haven't seen that, and I think one of the pieces is also just how an organization is able to structure its EDI approach so that it is more decentralized and everyone can come to see their role. So, for example, maybe part of a leadership ethos. I have seen folks that have organizations that have a staff advisory committee or more recently, we see employee resource groups. I think one of the most effective measures of implementation and one of the ways to really affect workplace culture, as you see as we've done in the protocol, is integrating it into performance appraisal processes so that everyone understands these EDI related competencies, has some support around them, and can see what their role is in advancing with the help and benefit of some key practitioners and structural supports, such as I mentioned.
So sort of speaking of, this approach of implementation, Debbie, maybe this is a question for you, but I think that even companies, and you use the word ambitious in your presentation, I really liked that. So, but even the companies with the most ambitious DEI policies can sometimes struggle to implement those policies sort of at all levels of an organization. Leslie just talked about sort of adding some aspects of it to the performance appraisal processes, but do you have any suggestions from your perspective on how we can make sure that every level of an organization is truly embracing these ED&I practices?
Sarah, email, Cam, email.
Oh, I think someone put self on mute. Okay. Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, I've been in this project role for a bit over a year now, and before that I was in a more global HR role within the Montreal office. So I've learned a lot, kind of digging deep to understand how to, and still learning how to successfully implement. Oh, I think Mika, if you could put yourself on mute, please. And one thing that I think is a challenge, and I don't know if it's a challenge for others, is the fact that communication, I think, regardless of whether it's EDI or anything else, if you're trying to influence, it's a challenge from a communication standpoint at the mine sites. People are not in front of their computers. You can't just have a lunch and learn and we all go down to the office, right? There's shift work and there's different rotations. We don't have big fancy conference rooms at every part of the mine. So I think understanding how you can communicate with your people will be successful for anything from EDI to anything related to people, anything related to safety. I think any programs you're trying to implement, you need to understand what are the best ways to connect with our people realistically within our organization at different levels. And because it's typically easier at the corporate level than it is at the site level. And it's the site level that, well, they're all important, but there's particular challenges at the site level we want to address. And if we don't learn how to best reach them in a way that works for them, how can they see the policies if they don't they've never heard of them? So I think communication first. I would suggest just do a deep dive of what works best and what are the challenges of connecting with your people and work from there.
Thank you. Leslie, I think we have a question in the chat that you would be really well suited to answer, and that's around how small consultancies or employers within the mining industry can be included in inclusiveness improvement efforts. And a bit of background on this, sometimes smaller companies aren't required to participate in some of the labor-related rules and regulations. Sometimes those requirements could be seen as too onerous for a small company. So maybe for small companies, where should we start?
I think there's two key pieces. Take stock of what you're doing already. There are things you're likely doing that you can build off of, and then and determine your next steps from, and build small successes, and then take stock of what your regulatory compliance requirements are under legislation. I think it's important just to make sure that you've got a sense of that you're not at risk with regard to some of those elements in your organization. And so looking at those two things, you can make some steps in the right direction and have some small wins that help people gain understanding and awareness and get involved.
Thank you.
I could maybe jump in on that as well, just from a TSM perspective. So, TSM is primarily in Canada implemented by kind of medium to larger companies with operating mines. That's the condition of membership in the Mining Association of Canada. If a company wants to be a member of the association, it's a requirement that their operating mine sites are adhering to these protocols. But that certainly doesn't mean that others, perhaps smaller companies, or even those, I know we've had interest, for example, from mining service suppliers, which are not typically covered under TSM. Those smaller companies can certainly use these protocols. I focused my presentation more on level A, AA, AAA requirements because level A is good practice and beyond, but we also do have level C and level B requirements. So a really good place to start could be to think about the protocol and each indicator as a bit of a step-by-step process where they look at what are the requirements to meet a level B and maybe focusing for some period of time on achieving those, and simply using the tool to conduct a gap analysis rather than expecting that as a small company they're going to get to level AAA relatively quickly. It may just be that they spend a few years working their way towards level B across all of the indicators.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to something that Debbie was talking about, right? Of like using the tools becoming really helpful just even for the self-assessment phase, right? So as a small employer or a small consulting firm, using the tools to do self-assessment and gap assessment is a fantastic way to use the protocols. While we're talking about AAA, AA ratings, there's a question I think for you, Katherine, in the chat around, is there a reason that procurement comes in at a AA rating for psychological safety and a AAA rating for EDI?
It may just have been the criteria I chose to highlight in my presentation, because in fact it is treated exactly the same in both protocols. So at level AA in both protocols, we don't use the word procurement, I don't think, but in the safety and health protocol, we say the facility communicates to its broader supply chain its policies and processes to promote psychological safety and respect. And then at level AAA, the facility integrates the principles of psychological safety and respect into its procurement processes and contractor relationships. And then, the exact same language at level AAA in the Equitable, Diverse, and Inclusive Workplaces protocol, but at level AA, essentially the same ideas. In the other protocol, we say the facility makes suppliers and service providers aware of its processes to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I think we can consider those as pretty parallel sets of requirements across the two protocols.
Great, that was a great clarification. Thank you so much. Debbie, there's a question in the chat just to build a little bit more on some of your points related to communications at the mine site. Do you have any success stories to share on that? Like what have, in your experience, has worked well for communicating these policies at mine sites?
Sure. There's one thing that worked well last year, is we kind of hopped onto other initiatives that were already in place, to events that were already in place for our people across sites. So for example, the health and safety team, they have an expo twice a year with different kiosks for all different safety measures. It could be, falling objects, it could be your fit masks, it could be wet surfaces. So, there's different booths for different safety initiatives. And when this project work started on Everyday Respect, so we hopped onto that event and we had a booth on Everyday Respect. It's not always easy to explain a report in a nutshell, in a 1 minute soundbite to people. So we tried to make it interactive. And what does inclusion mean to you? What do we do well? Where could we improve? And encourage them to look into it more. But if they don't, at least they're starting to hear us talk about respect more, and having a conversation, getting used to talking about it. So we shared the findings of that, and it was just Post-its. We tried to keep it light, but also thoughtful. But we caught everybody because the event was already in place and they already had the bus schedule set up to bring everyone to these safety events. So I would suggest see what's already in place with your other functional teams and see if you can hop onto it in some way. And I do think that connection with the safety team has been really important. And I think, as I mentioned, it will become increasingly important. So That's one thing that was quite successful. And we're also looking at ways to update the actual physical whiteboards across our sites, because they don't, again, they're not in front of computers. So we'll be working with the admin assistants across the sites to have some consistency in those paper posters and understanding what people look at, what they talk about, and a bit more connection on the ground and some consistency across the ground is what we're aiming towards.
Yeah, I love that, creating those visual prompts, which I think is why some of the poster materials that MiHR have developed are so valuable, Leslie. Tell me a little bit more about those. Are those like, how does someone order a poster from MiHR for these protocols?
There are those safe workplaces for all materials are available on our website. There's a size that you can download. So I think 11 by 17, you can download and print. And there's a size that you can order. And so we've got an order form online, and away you go. So we're happy to have people do that. We've also had companies work with us, with our marketing communications team, to also add their logo onto the poster. And so we're happy to do that also, if that's helpful for folks.
That's excellent. Thank you. Debbie, I really liked your point about, trying to integrate it into work that's already being done and integrate it into safety as an example, because safety is one of those things that I think has very much progressed over the last few years, and taking the concept of focusing on safety and embedding it through all levels of an organization. And so that's, I think, an example of where the industry has had real success. And I think sometimes we're really hard on ourselves on our progress in the ED&I space as well. So maybe just taking a minute here to reflect maybe on some past barriers that the industry has experienced, and maybe some of the things that have changed. So maybe Leslie, I know you've been leading research in this space. So tell us, what are we getting better at?
Well, I joined the sector in June of 2020, which, as Katherine said, was a real inflection point in terms of conversations around EDI. But I think particularly for the sector, there's been a discussion that, as I understand, has just really taken off in the sector over the last 4 years or so. Through our gender equity in mining course, we had the opportunity to look a little bit at the history of gender diversity in the sector. And we need to recognize that mining's been going on these lands since 1577, and that women have been in the sector really since about the mid-late 70s. So that's a short history of diversification. And we know also, we feature through the anti-racism modules, that there are times when particular groups were excluded from the sector through very direct mechanisms. So we've got some work to do there, and that work is progressing. And so I think the discussions around systemic and moving that to systemic barriers and systemic processes and systemic change are fundamental advantages. I think that the TSM protocols and their implementation are going to be a real game changer.
I'm going to throw out a bit of a wild card question, so feel free, anybody, to jump on it. And I want to talk a little bit about early engagement in people early in their career into the mining industry, especially because of what we've seen, regarding like mining engineering enrollments down. I think it's something like 50% from 2014 to 2022, and like geological engineering's down a very similar equivalent percentage. What can we be doing to entice people to join mining in their career, early in their career?
I can jump in on some of that, just owing to some of the work that MiHR has been doing. And I think there's a question in the chat that maybe relates to this also, in terms of that employee, the value for employees. So the sector is facing some real talent needs and a shortage of talent. And so necessarily diversifying the workforce is going to be a key approach to addressing this problem, this shortage. Our research, again, I think it's available on our website. We have polled youth in the last couple of years. There have been some improvements made with regard to youth perceptions of mining, but youth perceptions do fall really quite short. We sit, I'll say, still last amongst all of the sectors in terms of positive perception that youth have of the sector. So in terms of what can we do, it's really helping people to understand, and there's work being done on this, helping people to understand the importance of mining in terms of a transition to a clean economy, the opportunities available in mining. You know, many youth who are interested in maybe having different lifestyles, having adventure and being in different places are very interested in the opportunities available through mining. And then also ensuring that people can access the economic benefits and prosperity that mining has to have. So that's a key of diversifying the workforce, sharing those benefits around. We do have a Mining Needs You website with a host of career materials on there. We're just launching mining related careers curriculum. And so I will put that website in our chat.
Thank you. Okay, talking about the importance of mining, one of the things that I think has been really interesting to see is the role that Canada's best practices have been playing globally. So Katherine, I know you presented that map earlier on in your presentation about all of these mineral associations that have been adopting TSM. Can you talk a little bit about how you help these mineral associations all around the world integrate some of these newer protocols?
Yeah, sure. So this protocol was actually the first that we've developed collaboratively with our other TSM partner associations. In particular, the Minerals Council of Australia was actively involved in the working group and the design of this protocol. So that was really exciting because historically, being a Canadian program, initially a lot of the time we were developing the protocols in Canada and then sharing them with other jurisdictions. So to have their input from the beginning was really valuable. And they had a lot of expertise and different perspectives to bring to the protocol, which I think strengthened it as well. And the Minerals Council of Australia formally adopted the protocol just a couple of months after MAC published it for their application by their members. And I think, in fact, just given their overall TSM implementation schedule, I think we will even expect to see many mine sites in Australia reporting publicly on the protocol in some cases before we've even reached the stage of public reporting for sites in Canada. So that's really positive. I think there's definitely lots of interest from our other partner associations. I think even just on today's call, I saw on the participant list, we have representatives from our TSM partner associations in places like Colombia, Norway, Finland, and some others from MAC member companies that will be implementing the protocol at their sites outside of Canada. So I think certainly, work is underway. We're also working with our partner associations on translations of the protocol to different languages. We currently have drafts in French and Spanish, which should be finalized soon. I think some of our partner associations are likely working on translations to other languages as well. And I think it's worth noting as well that, as you saw in my presentation at level A, the criteria really are focused on engagement first with the workforce, with external communities of interest, especially in the case where their workforce perhaps isn't currently very diverse and needing to bring in those external perspectives. And I think the reason we designed it with that approach was recognizing that not only in Canada are mine sites in very different, cultural contexts, very different points in their EDI journeys, but this approach would also be relevant in other, perhaps vastly different cultural and legal contexts around the world. So, there's that opportunity as our other TSM partner associations adopt these protocols for their companies and their mindsets to think about, what are relevant and ambitious strategies, policies, procedures, objectives in their specific jurisdictions. So we're hopeful that approach will translate quite well to other contexts as we roll things out.
Thank you. Well, we're starting to get to the end of our time, so maybe just some final thoughts. Was there anything that you wanted to share that we didn't get to yet today? Debbie, any final takeaways?
Maybe, but just before, I think Glenn had his hand up. Not sure if he still wanted to share.
Yeah, actually, I did. Thanks. So Glenn Nolan, I'm with Wailu Ring of Fire, and I just wanted to, I guess, share that I think that we want to get to that point where we feel that we've reached all of our objectives, but that is a whole cultural shift. It's not just a mining shift; it's cultural shift, and we're going to have to. There's a lot of work to do with that. But on the positive, totally positive side is that we're seeing growth with women in mining. We're seeing like I've been in this industry for over almost 50 years, and when I started, there was very few women that were involved, and there was very few, even smaller number of professionals. And now we're seeing tremendous amount of engineers and geologists that are filling the ranks, and we have them. Indigenous people are, I think, our percentage of employment is around 12%, and that goes through the whole spectrum, including executive right through to the the entry-level jobs. So I think there's a lot of positive things that we can look at in what we're doing. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, but I think that by having these kind of discussions, we're going to get there sooner than later.
Thank you so much, Glenn. What a positive note for us to leave on. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I'm always nice to sort of reflect on, yes, we've got a lot of work to do, but you know what? We've achieved some really positive things as well in the last few years. So yeah, Debbie, was there any final thoughts to build on Glenn's positivity?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It takes time. So sometimes it can feel like frustrating work when you want things to go faster. But I think those look for the wins that are happening and celebrate them, as Leslie mentioned, and recognize that it takes time. And that's what I would say.
Thanks. Leslie, final thoughts?
Well, I really like what Glenn had to say, and I'll just compliment or add to that by saying the mining sector is actually very well situated to make a contribution to this broader discussion and broader societal change. And I think, when it gets a little bit difficult and challenging within one's own organization, I always find it helpful to think to that broader picture and say, well, what's our contribution here? How is that leading to different change, and how we're influencing or maybe affecting this broader conversation? So that's very exciting.
Oh, great point. It's all about influencing and what can we contribute. Katherine?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to pick up on Debbie's comment as well about how this can be a long process, I think from a TSM perspective, we still, of course, are really in early stages of implementation of these new requirements. Of course, it's really encouraging to see that Debbie's team has already found this to be a useful tool, but I'm sure we're, of course, going to continue to learn about application of this protocol, additional tools and resources and guidance that might be required to support implementation by companies as they work towards that requirement of public reporting beginning in 2026. So we have some time to get there, but not too much time, and we're certainly going to all be thinking about this as an opportunity to learn from the implementation experience.
Well, I know that we could probably talk about this all day, I think we're just coming up on time. If there are any questions in the chat that we didn't get to, we will follow up with you. Thank you, everybody who was able to join us today. A special thank you to our panelists. I think really shared some just incredible insights and experience. I also want to let everybody know that this session has been recorded and it will be available on the CIM's DIAC website for you to come back to, refer to, or to share with your colleagues. This is also the first webinar of 5 sessions that CIM DIAC has planned to review the TSM Equitable, Diverse, and Inclusive Workplace Protocol. So our next session will focus on Indicator 1, which is Leadership and Strategy. It's going to be held on Wednesday, February 14th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I really hope that you can all join us again there. It's just been a fantastic conversation, and I hope it will continue. Thank you so much.